So we were talking, of course, about the fact that we are assessing, or we should be assessing all the time. We are assessing as our students are sharing their prior knowledge. We are assessing as they are engaged in practice. We should be also assessing as they apply what they've learned. We should also be assessing them as we engage them in noticing, all right? Whether it is inductive grammar or any other type of language focus instance of the class. And of course, we should also be assessing them as they are performing during a final task or a project. So something that, of course, uh, I need to mention is the fact that not only do we assess our students informally, all right, but we must also assess them formally. The best or most common example of formal assessment has to do with providing students with exams, all right? And of course, even though our students are not in the classroom with us, and we cannot give them an exam per se where students are having an exam on a given date and they have to sit down, okay, here's your exam, everybody in silence working. We cannot do that. There are, of course, very good ways of assessing our students formally, remotely, okay? So this is what completes this question or this picture when it comes to assessment. So something that I think we need to work on now is some of the types of assessment, okay? Because when it comes to assessment, we've got like two big categories, okay? We are talking about formative assessment and summative assessment. And again, we will be discussing not only the differences, but also the similarities. That is why I am presenting formative and summative assessment to you with a Venn diagram, all right? So let us talk about what formative assessment is. Formative assessment is when, of course, we are monitoring our students' learning. We want to check on their progress, okay? We want to check their understanding. And the idea is that we want to be responsive to that. What does that mean? As I was mentioning before, not only are we assessing just because we have to assess, but we are actually gathering evidence, evidence of progress, evidence of learning, and we are responding to that. What does that mean? If I feel I've got green light, then I keep moving. If I feel my students need anything because I do not have a green light, I've got yellow or red, well, I'm acting or I am making decisions or doing something in response to that. Now, as I said before, this assessment is not just for the teacher, it's also for the students. So when it comes to students, they can also check on their own learning. They build knowledge. They not only the teacher will identify where my student is right and where my student still needs any help or further practice, but students will identify uh, uh, strengths and weaknesses. I don't know if I would like to call it strengths and weaknesses, but definitely what's okay and where definitely they are making progress, and what might need a little bit of more scaffolding or further practice, or maybe a different way of explaining it to them because they didn't get it. They are not there yet, which does not mean that they will not learn it, okay? They need something else, all right? And of course, the idea is that they continue learning and making progress so that they target learning. So again, we've got the learning objectives, okay? And this is why I was saying before, and I said it also in Module 3, it is so important to share learning objectives with our students. So formative assessment is kind of ongoing, all right? I am paying attention to everything my students do, all right? And at given moments, I stop and I make them reflect upon where they are and how far they are from that learning objective, okay? So are we fine? Do we have a green light? Do we have a yellow light? Do we have a red light? So that is what formative assessment is. Summative assessment, and when it comes to educators, it's to measure whether a student has met certain learning outcomes and to what extent at the end of a unit, okay, for example. So summative assessment is that assessment that we do at the end of a unit, or it might be at the end of a lesson, at the end of a sequence of lessons, okay? So it's not ongoing like formative assessment, it's summative. It's at the end of, to actually check or assess if what has been taught and learned throughout a lesson or throughout a sequence of lessons or throughout a unit has been achieved by students. And once again, when it comes to educators, when it comes to teachers, it has to provide you with evidence to act upon. And when it comes to students, okay, this summative assessment is going to give them the possibility to understand, okay, how much they can do after a unit, after a lesson, or after a sequence of lessons. And of course, this is going to give them evidence as for whether they have achieved these learning objectives, okay? To what extent they have achieved these learning objectives. And again, this is giving students evidence to act upon. So we've got these main differences in the sense that formative, okay, I'm constantly checking, okay, and I am reflecting, not only me, the teacher, but also students, reflecting on where they are, strengths and weaknesses, and what needs to improve so that they keep on making progress. And summative at the end of a unit, at the end of a sequence of lessons, or at the end of a lesson. Let us pay attention also at what is it that these two types of assessment have in common. Both are ways of gathering evidence of learning, definitely. Both are opportunities to give and receive feedback. What does that mean? Let us pay attention to formative assessment, okay? I stop at a given moment of a lesson or at a given moment of a sequence of lessons, and I stop and reflect. I gather evidence and I reflect together with my students as for where they are and how far they are from the learning objective. So students gain feedback from me. I give my students feedback. I help them move on. And what might also happen is that students give me feedback as for how they feel, if they feel they get it, if they feel there's something they don't understand. So feedback comes and goes. And of course, in the case of both are ways to evaluate the effectiveness of teaching. Informative assessment, as we gather evidence, one of the reflections has to do with, have I used the right presentation technique? When I presented this, was it clear? Have I given my students enough controlled practice? Is it a possibility that they might probably need further practice? Was this effective? Did they actually like this activity, or they were so bored that it ended up being counterproductive? Whatever, whether it is formative assessment or summative assessment, reflection upon teaching and also reflection upon learning are absolutely important. In the case of summative assessment, it's the same thing. That is why I always tell teachers that when you give, for example, exams, it's not just about returning the exam with a grade so that students put it inside their folders and they forget about it. I am absolutely in favor of doing remedial work, going over what was not okay, so that next time you don't make the same mistake, or next time you focus a little bit more on that. So whether it is formative assessment or summative assessment, again, we are talking about gathering evidence. Again, we are talking about the importance of feedback. And again, we are talking about the two main actors here, teacher and students. So moving on, as you can see on the screen, you've got a connecting thread, all right? So we will be connecting this module to the previous ones. Why is it that we've left assessment for module 4, and how does the content we are covering in this module 4 refer to the content covered in the previous modules? Well, we've dedicated quite a lot of time to talking about lesson stages, and I think we've even made it the main point here. All right, like we've been talking about the fact that lesson stages and the good structure of a lesson is not only something that we have to consider in a traditional teaching and learning situation, but that this is transferable to this new reality. We've been mentioning the lesson stages that make a lesson be effective and well structured. And we've been talking about, I think this is something that we also devoted a lot of time to in Module 3. We talked about how important it is to have clear objectives, and we've been repeating over and over again that the clarity of objectives is one of the keys to a successful lesson. So we've spoken about unit objectives, we've talked about warming up, and we've talked about elicitation, and we've also talked about presentation, and I think it was in module 1 that we talked about the golden rules when it comes to presenting vocabulary or presenting grammar. And we've even spoken about integrating the presentation, integrating vocabulary with grammar. We talked about moving from controlled practice to freer practice. We also discussed the importance of moving a step forward into this stage of application. And then we also mentioned how important it is to plan some sort of final task or mini project where students will demonstrating what they can do after a lesson, a sequence of lessons, or a unit. And of course, we've now started talking about assessment and how the evidence we gather from this assessment needs to help us reflect upon our practice, and students reflect upon their practice as students too, so that we make decisions for the future. So as you can see, clarity in learning objectives, presenting these learning objectives to our students, this is absolutely critical for assessment. And we will be moving forward and checking on this in depth. As you can see, it's essential that we provide high quality feedback as students move from controlled practice, which is a little bit more restrictive and more repetitive, until we let go, all right? And if you think about it, this is applicable to anything, okay? Now, when you are learning anything, you rely on feedback to make progress. And you move from the easiest to the most difficult, and feedback helps you move forward. This final task or this mini project, which when talking about Bloom's taxonomy was the top of the pyramid, of course is absolutely related to those learning objectives. In that final task, in that mini project, students will be able to show me that what they can do, and it is related to the learning objectives. And of course, when it comes to assessment and the follow-up, it's the moment of decisions to move forward. Decisions are made throughout. Remember that assessment is done all throughout. But in this particular moment, we make decisions for the future in a future lesson or in a future unit. Okay.